Segment 4, Beyond the Water's Edge. Richard Nixon, address to the nation, April 30th, 1970. This is a couple months before you began working on this book. Quote, "Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam." Close quote. President Barack Obama, address at the United States Military Academy, December 1st, 2009, when you were working on this edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Quote, "I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 troops to Afghanistan." Close quote. From the Cold War to the War on Terror, what has that meant for American politics?
Well, in 1970, when I was writing this book, we really, America had emerged out of the Cold War consensus and into Cold War contention, if you will. I mean, the first 20 years of the Cold War, say from 1947 to 67, you had pretty much a bipartisan consensus. You had some Republicans. Senator Robert Taft voted against the NATO treaty, for example. That's why General Dwight Eisenhower ran against him for the nomination. He wanted to preserve the European alliance. But there was pretty much a consensus. And then during the Vietnam War, you get the emergence of an anti-war movement. Interestingly, it has started against the policy of a Democratic president, but the Democratic politicians don't embrace it until we get a Republican president, Richard Nixon. And then it becomes Nixon's war, and we have a partisan sort of tilt to it.
How did that happen from John Kennedy, who ran to the right of Richard Nixon on defense policy, accusing Nixon and Eisenhower of the missile gap, from John Kennedy in 1960 to George McGovern just a dozen years later?
I think a key thing in that, and I'm not sure I ever wrote about it in the Almanac, is the draft policy and the retention of the World War II era, actually, or post-war era, deferments for college students and so forth. This was a war in which the decision makers did not think it was worthwhile to send their sons to fight. And you get two responses from that. You get from the class of people whose sons went to fight, you get a sort of disillusionment with it.
And they feel tainted, they feel guilty, they know what's going on.
And from that sort of upper class, the college class people, the sons feel a need to justify themselves, and they start, basically thinking, this is not a country worth fighting for. And that attitude infects the college-educated, elite university-educated elite, and affects it to the present day to some extent, some lingering extent. And you get an upper class with sort of an adversary attitude towards America's policy in the world. And I think that 1970 was about the beginning of that period.
Let me ask you to explain another transition within a party. 1970. The Republican Party is still dominated by the Northeast, by moderates or liberals. Richard Nixon, Nixon, of course, is a Californian.
He was a New York voter when he was elected president in 1968.
He thinks New York is where the action is, and in those days, in some ways, he's right. Nelson Rockefeller of New York, William Scranton of Pennsylvania. You get a toughness toward the Soviet Union, but also a kind of eagerness to engage in détente. By 1980, I'm asking with regard to foreign affairs here. By 1980, the Republican Party is the party of Reagan. How did that happen?
Well, I think part of it is the answer I gave to the previous question. The East Coast elites became Democrats. I mean, John D. Rockefeller IV was offered when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Nelson Rockefeller, as governor of New York, would appoint a successor. He called his nephew Jay and said, "You want to be a senator? I'll appoint."
Is that well known?
I believe that's known. Yeah, I'll appoint you a senator as a Republican. And Jay said, "No, I want to be a Democrat." He was down in West Virginia, doing anti-poverty work, running for Secretary of State of West Virginia, and so forth. So that generation, that sort of group, the Bushes were unusual. But remember that George H.W. Bush had moved off to Texas.
So he got out of the whole scene.
In 1946, and he moved to the area that turned out to be where the Republican Party would be on the rise, and left the area of the Northeast where the Republican Party would be on the decline. So I think that's one element. The other element is the demographic variables. mean, if you go back to the 1930s and 40s, New York had 45 congressional districts, Pennsylvania had 33. The next highest state was down about 18 or 17 or something. Or Illinois was in the low 20s. So, you know, those were the base. Those were the base for the East Coast Republicans and the people that nominated Wendell Willkie, Thomas Dewey, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon. You know, population and political power shifts to the Californias, the Texas, and the South, which had been solidly Democratic, and whose politicians had been supporters of, or hostages to at least, the policy of racial segregation, suddenly becomes Republican and is no longer weighed down with that issue of racial segregation, but because with the success of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 65, you have a negligible percentage of Americans who want to bring back legally enforced racial segregation. So the South becomes part of the Union, and it becomes first at the presidential level, and then by the 1990s at the congressional level, a Republican region.
Let me ask you one last question about foreign policy. Barack Obama sends 30,000 additional troops to Afghanistan. By the time he steps down, will we have achieved a kind of bipartisan consensus in the war on terror, like the one in the Cold War?
I'm not sure we will. I note that quite a few Democratic members of Congress now are opposing President Obama on his Afghanistan policy, or at least casting votes that are highly critical of it. And I see something that looks a little bit like the Democratic opposition to Lyndon Johnson in the late years of his administration on the Vietnam War, kind of a peace party. It's peacenik, the term Time magazine used in the early 60s when it was a liberal Republican publication. And so I do see a split there. I think there's a large part, not perhaps a majority, but a large part of the Democratic Party, both its politicians and its constituencies, who basically don't feel this is a very good country, that we're often wrong in the world, that we are, as affluent, mostly white people, oppressors in the world, and that military action by the United States is a bad thing. And I think that segment of the electorate is important. I think on some issues, Barack Obama seems to share those views. On Iraq and Afghanistan, he seemed to share those views on Iraq as a senator. He is not as a president. He has not shared those views on Afghanistan, but I think that's a part of the American electorate that is significant, that was dormant during the period 1947 to 67, the period of Cold War consensus. Mm-hmm. That was a major force in the Democratic Party in the second half of the Cold War, let's say 1947 to 89. It was the kind of people that didn't like hearing a phrase, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's
still there.
It's still part of our thing. And in fact, if you go before the years of World War II, there was a kind of left-wing isolationism that was a part of the country too. So that Cold War consensus, which many people look back on as, hey, that was the period when America was America, may have been the anomaly. You go back to World War I, there were 56 members of the House and I think a dozen senators who voted against the declaration of war in World War I. That's a significant percentage of the Congress.